My name's Ryan. I'm 32, and for as long as I can remember, my family has been convinced I'm a walking disappointment. It didn't matter what I did. If my older brother bought a used car, they'd brag about it for months. But if I closed a major business deal, they'd barely look up from their phones. Growing up, I learned early that praise in my household was reserved for anyone but me. Over the years, I built a quiet habit. I stopped telling them anything about my life. Not my plans, not my successes, not the fact that I had quietly built 3 companies from the ground up. To them, I was still the broke kid who never did anything right. The conversation that lit the fuse happened in my parents' living room one rainy Saturday afternoon. I had stopped by because my mother said she wanted to discuss something important. When I arrived, my parents were sitting side by side on the couch, arms crossed, faces cold. My brother, Mark, was leaning in the doorway with that smug half-smile he always wore when he thought he was about to watch me get humiliated. My father's voice was sharp and final. "Ryan, you're on your own now. We can't keep helping you. You're a grown man. It's time you stopped being a burden." I just blinked at him. I hadn't asked for help in years. My mom chimed in with a pitying sigh. "We know things have been hard for you, but at some point you have to accept reality. You can't just drift forever." They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask about my work. They didn't care. Mark snorted, tossing in his 2 cents. "Face it, Ryan. You've always been the broke disgrace of the family. You should be grateful they've supported you this long." I looked around the room, taking in the cheap satisfaction on their faces, and felt something click into place. That moment, the smugness, the dismissal, burned itself into my mind. They thought they were cutting me off. The truth? I'd been financially independent for nearly a decade. What they didn't know was that I had more money in one of my company's petty cash accounts than they'd seen in their entire lives. Still, I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. I simply stood up, walked down the hallway, and began packing the few personal items I kept at their house from my younger years. My dad muttered something about me finally learning to fend for myself as I passed him, but I kept my face neutral. In that moment, my silence was deliberate, almost surgical. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of an argument. They'd already written their version of the story, and nothing I said would change it. Better to let them believe it for now. As I left with my small duffel bag, the rain had picked up, splattering across the windshield of my car. My phone buzzed with a single text from my mom. "We hope this will be a wake-up call for you." I stared at the words for a long time before putting the phone face down on the passenger seat. There was no anger, just a deep, quiet resolve settling in my chest. If they wanted distance, they were going to get it. But I already knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. What they didn't realize was that in a matter of weeks, they'd be forced to see the real picture. And they wouldn't be able to ignore it, no matter how much they wished they could. And the first seed of that moment was planted the very next day, when I got an unexpected phone call that set everything in motion. The next morning, I woke up to a string of missed calls from my mother. At first, I thought maybe someone had gotten sick or there was an emergency. But when I finally listened to her voicemail, it was just her telling me that Mark needed a loan and that I should be a team player for once. No good morning. No, how are you? Not even a hint that we just had a conversation the day before where they essentially disowned me. It was surreal, like they'd reset the board overnight and assumed I'd play along as the family's punching bag again. I didn't respond. Instead, I went about my day, focusing on meetings with my management teams and finalizing a deal with a new supplier for one of my companies. But the calls kept coming, this time from Mark himself. His tone was smug at first, then impatient when I didn't answer, and finally flat out insulting in the string of texts that followed. "You still living in that dump? Don't act like you can't spare a few hundred for your brother." That few hundred was quickly upgraded to a few thousand once he explained that he had an opportunity to invest in a friend's startup. I knew exactly what that meant. Mark had found another one of his gambling buddies with a can't-lose scheme. That week, my parents hosted one of their regular family dinners, and despite the sting from our last conversation, I decided to attend, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to see how far this favoritism would go when I gave them nothing to work with. The second I walked through the door, I might as well have been invisible. Mark was holding court at the table, talking about his business prospects, while my parents nodded approvingly. He didn't have a business. He had a series of failed ventures and debt collectors who knew him by name. But you wouldn't know that by the way they were looking at him like he was some visionary. When I tried to join the conversation, my mother cut me off mid-sentence to ask Mark about his next steps. My father poured him a drink, calling him the go-getter in the family. I sat there quietly, sipping water, watching this theater unfold. At one point, my mom actually said, "If only Ryan had your ambition, Mark." I nearly laughed out loud at the irony. My lack of ambition had built 3 companies and employed more than 50 people. Then came the moment that solidified everything for me. After dinner, as everyone was lingering in the living room, my father handed Mark an envelope, cash. A lot of it. My mom smiled and said, "Just to help you get started, honey. We know you'll do great things." I wasn't offered a dime. I wasn't even acknowledged. It was as if the earlier conversation in which they cut me off was really just their way of saying they'd chosen who they were investing in, and it wasn't me. On the drive home, I replayed the night in my head, not with anger this time, but with a kind of cold clarity. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a deliberate rewriting of reality. In their minds, Mark was the achiever, and I was the perpetual failure, no matter what I actually accomplished. And they were committed to that version of the story because it gave them someone to feel superior to. I knew then that proving them wrong wouldn't be enough. They needed to be confronted with the truth in a way that would shatter the fantasy they'd built. But before that could happen, the tension would need to reach its breaking point. And that came faster than I expected when they involved me in something I had no intention of touching. It was a Thursday afternoon when the betrayal landed in my lap. I was in my office going over quarterly reports when my phone buzzed with a message from my bank. At first, I thought it was just a routine notification until I saw the amount. A withdrawal of $7,500 had been made from one of my personal accounts. Not my business accounts, one of my private, untouched for years savings accounts that I kept more for sentiment than utility. My chest tightened. The account was supposed to be locked down, accessible only by me. Or so I thought. I called the bank immediately, and after a long chain of security questions and holds, the representative told me the withdrawal had been made in person at a branch in my parents' neighborhood. The signature on the slip? My own name, or at least someone's attempt at it. That's when the rep casually added, "It was processed without issue because your mother was on the account as a secondary holder." My stomach dropped. I hadn't even realized her name was still attached. It dated back to when I opened the account at 18. I didn't have to guess where the money went. Later that evening, my suspicion was confirmed in the most brazen way possible. I got a group text from my mom, my dad, and Mark, an image of him leaning against a shiny, candy-red motorcycle, grinning like a lottery winner. The caption from my mom read, "Mark finally got the bike he deserves. We all chipped in to help him out." The word "all" burned into me. They weren't pretending to hide it. They were proud of what they'd done. When I called my mother, she answered cheerfully, as if nothing had happened. "Oh, Ryan, you sound upset. You know Mark's been dreaming about that bike for years. We thought it was only fair to give him a little boost." I was silent for a beat, my jaw tightening. "With my money?" I finally asked. There was a pause, then a dismissive laugh. "Oh, please. It was just sitting there. You never used that account. And besides, family helps family. One day you'll understand." That was the moment something shifted in me. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was theft, plain and simple. And the way she spoke, the way she dismissed it, told me everything I needed to know. They didn't see it as wrong. In their eyes, my hard-earned money was just part of the family's communal pool, free to be tapped whenever the golden child needed it. Over the next few days, the betrayal festered. My father doubled down, calling me selfish for making a fuss over a few $1,000s. Mark sent me a smug text, "Don't be sore, man. I'll take you for a ride sometime." That was his idea of gratitude. The worst part wasn't even the theft. It was how casually they'd done it, how convinced they were that I wouldn't, or couldn't, do anything about it. That week, I didn't reach out. I didn't confront them further. I just let the silence grow, knowing that they'd interpret it as sulking. In reality, I was putting pieces together, mentally cataloging every insult, every slight, every time they'd taken without asking. And I was starting to see a path forward. A slow, deliberate path that would require patience, but when it was finished, there'd be no going back for any of us. Then, right when the air between us was already thick with tension, they made another move. One so audacious it nearly took my breath away. 2 weeks after the motorcycle stunt, I got a call from my landlord. Well, not my actual landlord, but the one who managed the small condo I'd been renting for years as my city base. He sounded uneasy, almost embarrassed. "Ryan, I don't know how to say this, but your parents came by today. They told the building management you'd moved out and weren't paying rent anymore. They even tried to get into your unit." At first, I thought he had to be mistaken. But then he explained they had shown up with a stack of papers, photocopies of old bills with my name on them, a letter claiming they were responsible for me, and even some outdated ID copies from when I lived under their roof. They told the building manager they were taking over my unit because I couldn't handle things on my own. I sat there, stunned, holding the phone to my ear as my landlord went on about how he'd had to refuse them entry and call security. The sheer audacity left me in a daze. It wasn't enough that they stole from me. They were now trying to dismantle the life I'd built entirely, to paint me as incompetent to strangers, to insert themselves where they had no right. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. I wasn't financially struggling, far from it, but the psychological weight was crushing. I realized that even with all the distance I'd tried to create, they still had little hooks in my life. Old accounts, old addresses, scraps of outdated authority they could twist into leverage. They didn't need permission, they'd just take. A few days later, my father left me a voicemail that felt more like a threat disguised as concern. "Son, you're making this harder than it needs to be. We've been doing our best to look out for you. But if you keep acting like you don't need us, don't be surprised when you find doors closing on you. We know people." His tone was calm, almost patronizing, but the message was clear. They were willing to tarnish my name if it meant keeping me in their control. For the first time in years, I felt truly cornered. Every instinct screamed to lash out, to confront them head-on, to call them thieves and manipulators to their faces. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew they'd just twist it, make me the villain. If I was going to win this, it couldn't be in the heat of an argument. It had to be planned, precise. So I started quietly cutting every remaining tie. I closed the old savings account. I transferred my city base to a new property under one of my holding companies so my name wouldn't even be on the public record. I updated every piece of contact information with banks, utilities, and professional networks. To the outside world, it probably looked like I was pulling away out of bitterness, but in reality, I was methodically erasing every thread they could tug on. It was lonely. Some nights I'd sit in my kitchen, staring at my phone, half hoping for a genuine apology, half knowing it would never come. Every family photo on my shelf started to feel like a lie. And still, even as I fortified my life against them, I could feel their shadow stretching over me. I thought I had more time before they tried something else. I thought my silence and distance might cool things down. But I was wrong. Because the very next month, I got an invitation that would drag me back into their orbit, one I couldn't ignore, and one that would put me face to face with all of them in a room I couldn't easily walk out of. The invitation came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope with gold lettering. Inside was a glossy card announcing my parents' 40th wedding anniversary celebration, complete with an RSVP card and a note in my mother's looping handwriting. "It would mean a lot if you could come. Family should be together on special occasions." I almost laughed. Family should be together? Where was that sentiment when they emptied my savings account or tried to take over my home? But I didn't throw it away. Instead, I placed it on my desk, right beside my laptop, and let it sit there as I thought about what my life looked like now compared to the version they believed. In the months since cutting my last remaining ties, things had accelerated for me in ways I hadn't even planned. One of my companies had landed a major contract with a European distributor, and the influx of revenue was staggering. Another business I'd founded years ago, a small but promising tech startup, was quietly bought out by a larger firm, putting a seven-figure payout directly into my account. And my third company, a consultancy I ran under the radar, had just expanded into 2 new cities. I'd never been one to flaunt wealth, but now I was starting to see the strategic value in letting it be known, at the right time, to the right people. I upgraded my city residence from the modest condo to a luxury penthouse overlooking the river, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and a private rooftop terrace. I bought a car I'd always admired, a sleek, midnight blue coupe that seemed to glide rather than drive. I even started working with a personal assistant, freeing up more of my time to focus on the bigger picture. Physically, I changed too. Months of working with a personal trainer had me in better shape than I'd been since my early 20s, and my wardrobe had shifted from comfortable and forgettable to tailored suits, clean lines, and confidence. I wasn't just financially independent now. I was in control, sharp, and ready. What surprised me most was how light I felt. The absence of their constant criticism was like fresh air. I surrounded myself with people who actually respected me, business partners, close friends, even a few mentors who had nothing to gain from me except good conversation. My circle was smaller, but infinitely stronger. Still, that invitation sat on my desk, untouched. I'd glance at it during late-night work sessions, wondering if showing up would be worth the trouble. Part of me wanted to ignore it entirely, leave them in the dark forever. But another part of me, the strategic part, saw the opportunity. An event where everyone in the extended family would be present. A place where my parents and Mark couldn't spin their narrative without me standing right there, living proof of the truth. If I went, I knew I couldn't just walk in as Ryan who survived their treatment. I'd have to arrive as someone they couldn't dismiss, someone they couldn't talk over or minimize. That meant planning, not just my entrance, but the entire way I would carry myself in that room. The weeks leading up to the anniversary were almost like preparing for a high-stakes business pitch. I made subtle changes, choosing the perfect suit, confirming the right car service, arranging my schedule so I could arrive without rush. I even made sure a few select people in my extended family got a glimpse of my success beforehand, planting small seeds that would grow into whispers by the time I walked through those doors. By the time the day of the anniversary arrived, I was ready, more than ready. And as my car pulled up in front of the elegant hotel ballroom they'd rented for the event, I caught sight of my reflection in the tinted window. Calm, collected, not the broke disgrace they thought they'd thrown away, but the man they never imagined I could become. What I didn't know was that my arrival would trigger more than whispers. It would cause a ripple that would travel through that room faster than I could have planned. The hotel ballroom was buzzing when I walked in, warm lighting spilling across the polished floor, the low hum of conversation blending with the clink of glasses. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the shift. Heads turned, mid-sentence conversations paused for a fraction of a second. It wasn't just the suit or the car I'd pulled up in. It was the way I carried myself. I moved through the crowd slowly, greeting distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. Some of them gave me polite, guarded nods, clearly still under the impression that I'd been struggling. Others, the ones who had heard the whispers I'd carefully seeded, looked at me with thinly veiled curiosity. I could practically hear them wondering, what happened to Ryan? He's different. It didn't take long to find my parents and Mark. They were stationed at a table near the front, surrounded by a few of their closest allies. People who had no doubt been fed years of my parents' poor Ryan narrative. My mother's smile froze when she saw me. My father's eyes narrowed just slightly, a flicker of unease behind them. Mark, on the other hand, smirked like he was already planning some condescending comment. I didn't give them the chance. I simply smiled, offered a calm, good evening, and moved on to mingle. The beauty of the setup was that I didn't need to force anything. My presence alone was enough to stir the air. And that's when the first piece of useful information came my way. I was speaking with my cousin Emily, someone I'd always liked but rarely saw, when she leaned in a little closer and lowered her voice. Ryan, I don't know if you know this, but Mark's been telling people you're in debt, that you moved into some rundown apartment after your business collapsed. She glanced over her shoulder toward my parents' table. He's been bragging that Mom and Dad had to step in to keep you afloat. There it was, the narrative in action, shameless and unchecked. But Emily didn't stop there. Oh, and there's something else. Mark's been trying to pitch this investment opportunity to a bunch of relatives tonight. I overheard him telling Uncle Tom he's got your backing on it, that you're going to put in a large sum to make it happen. She looked at me, concerned. You're not, right? I almost laughed. So that was his angle. Use my supposed debt to get sympathy from some, and my fake backing to get credibility with others. He was trying to position me as his safety net in front of the whole family. It was manipulative, sloppy, and, most importantly, an opportunity. Because if Mark was building his pitch on my name, then all I had to do was make the truth public in a way that dismantled not just the lie, but the entire foundation of their image. And I had the perfect stage to do it, an event filled with family, friends, and people whose opinions my parents valued more than they'd ever admit. I kept my composure, thanking Emily for telling me, and continued to work the room. By the time dinner was served, I'd learned more than I expected. Not only had Mark been trying to rope relatives into his scheme, but my parents had been actively endorsing it, telling everyone they would match whatever I supposedly invested. They were leveraging my name and credibility without my consent and in front of an audience. That's when the final piece fell into place. The MC announced that after the meal, there would be a short segment for family tributes, a chance for relatives to share memories or well wishes for my parents. A microphone, a captive audience, and my name already on everyone's lips. All I had to do was wait for my turn. And when it came, I wasn't going to waste a single word. Dessert plates had just been cleared when the MC stepped up to the microphone, smiling warmly as he explained the family tributes segment. People laughed and clapped politely as a few aunts and uncles took turns sharing sentimental stories, childhood anecdotes about my parents, tales from family trips decades ago. It was lighthearted, harmless. Then the MC looked around the room, his eyes landing on me. "Ryan," he said, "I believe you wanted to say a few words." I stood, buttoning my suit jacket slowly. The room quieted, not completely, but enough that I felt dozens of eyes on me. I walked to the microphone, taking my time, my expression calm. My parents shifted slightly in their seats, a faint flicker of unease passing between them. Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking, clearly expecting me to stammer through something awkward or forgettable. I began with warmth, thanking everyone for coming together to celebrate such a long marriage. I spoke about how marriage was about building a legacy, not just financially, but in how you treat the people around you. Heads nodded, people smiled. My parents even relaxed a little, thinking I was going to keep it generic. Then I pivoted. "I've heard a lot of stories tonight," I said, scanning the crowd. "And it reminded me of how our family loves to tell stories. But sometimes, the stories people tell about you aren't quite true." A few eyebrows lifted. My gaze drifted toward Mark, just long enough for the shift in tone to land. "I understand there's been some talk, recently, even tonight, about my supposed financial troubles. That I've been struggling, that I'm in debt, that I've been relying on certain generous family members to stay afloat." I paused, letting the murmurs ripple. "So I want to be clear, for everyone here, once and for all, that story isn't true. In fact, it couldn't be further from the truth." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "In the last 12 months, the 3 companies I own have grown beyond anything I imagined. We employ over 50 people. We've expanded internationally. And last quarter alone, our combined revenue was," I named the figure, and the silence was immediate. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. I placed the envelope on the podium and continued. "This is a donation receipt from a recent charity auction I sponsored, in my own name. The amount is larger than the sum total of the so-called help I've supposedly received in my lifetime. I share this not to boast, but to set the record straight." My eyes swept across the room, landing squarely on Mark. "And for anyone who's been approached tonight about investing in a certain business venture, I want to make this crystal clear. I am not, and will not be, financially involved. If someone has used my name to imply otherwise, they are lying. I would strongly advise you to consider that before handing over a single cent." Gasps. Whispers. A few people outright turned to glare at my brother. Mark's smirk had vanished, replaced by the tight, pale look of someone whose scheme had just crumbled in public. My parents sat frozen, their smiles long gone, their eyes darting between me and the guests as if trying to gauge just how much damage had been done. I finished simply, thanking everyone again for being here, and stepped away from the microphone. No raised voice, no dramatic accusations, just a clean, surgical dismantling of their lies in front of every person whose opinion mattered to them. As I walked back to my seat, I could feel the shift in the room. Conversations were hushed but pointed, and none of them were about my supposed failures anymore. I passed my parents' table without looking at them, but I could feel the heat of their stares. Mark muttered something under his breath as I went by, but I didn't catch it, and I didn't care. Because the truth was out now, and it was bigger than their version of the story ever could be. What I didn't expect was how quickly the fallout would spread, faster and far more publicly than even I had planned. The fallout began before the night was even over. As the program wrapped up and people began milling around again, I noticed a small circle forming near the bar, half a dozen relatives speaking in low, clipped tones, their eyes flicking toward Mark. My cousin Emily caught my gaze from across the room and gave me a subtle nod, as if to say, "It's working." By the time I collected my coat, word had spread like wildfire. Several aunts and uncles had already pulled their hands back from Mark's investment pitch, suddenly remembering urgent reasons why they couldn't commit. One particularly blunt uncle told him flat out, "If Ryan's not backing you, I'm out." I didn't need to hear more to know the rest of the evening wouldn't go well for him. My parents, however, didn't approach me until almost everyone had left. My mother's smile was brittle, her voice pitched just high enough to sound polite, but tight with strain. "Ryan, was that really necessary?" she asked, each word clipped. My father's jaw was set. "You humiliated your family tonight," he added, the implication heavy, as if I was the one who had twisted the truth. I met their eyes evenly. "I didn't humiliate anyone. I just told the truth. You're upset because it's harder to control the narrative now." I let the words hang there, watching as the meaning landed. My mother's smile faltered. My father's mouth twitched like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. Mark didn't say a word to me that night. He just stormed past, his face flushed and tight, heading straight for the exit. Later, I'd hear from Emily that within a week, several relatives had called him out directly, demanding explanations for the lies. The investment idea was dead, his credibility in tatters. Worse for him, a few of those same relatives had quietly reached out to me for business advice, something I knew would sting far more than losing their money. As for my parents, the distance between us became a canyon. They stopped calling, stopped inviting me to smaller family events. And I let them. I didn't need to keep defending myself against people who had already decided who I was in their minds. My life, my work, and my relationships with people who respected me were worth far more than their approval ever could be. Months later, I hosted a charity gala for one of my companies. It was covered in the local paper, complete with photos of me standing alongside other business leaders. I didn't send them a copy of the article. I didn't need to. I knew they'd see it eventually, just like I knew they'd recognize that I'd built a life without them, and that it was better than anything they'd imagined for me. That night at the anniversary, as I'd walked away from the microphone, I realized something important. Revenge doesn't always come from shouting the loudest or winning the argument. Sometimes, it comes from calmly holding up a mirror so they can see exactly what they've become. And once they see it, they can never unsee it.